Kristen Wilson was late for dinner. That wasn't like her. The fact that it was Thanksgiving made her absence even more suspicious. Unable to reach her by phone, Kristen's parents drove to her home, where they found an unimaginable scene. Their daughter, lifeless on the floor of her own bedroom, the victim of a brutal murder. 29 years later, Kristen's family and friends still have more questions than answers.
Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurelis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife, Leah, as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laurelis was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and co-workers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. We'd like to highlight April as Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. Too many Americans have suffered as a result of this terrible crime. Sexual violence doesn't discriminate. Statistics show that 2 in 5 women and 1 in 4 men will experience sexual assault sometime throughout their life. If you or someone you know is a victim of sexual assault, the National Sexual Assault Hotline is 800-656-HOPE, HOPE, and we will list the National Sexual Violence resources in our show notes. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement Podcast and Justice for Leon Laurelis. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
1996 saw U.S. President Bill Clinton elected to a second term, beating out Bob Dole and Ross Perot. Madeleine Albright became the first female U.S. Secretary of State. The Taliban seized Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Eric Rudolph set off a bomb in Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta that killed 2 people at the 1996 Olympics. And Great Britain experienced an outbreak of mad cow disease.
Can you imagine if that happened today?
In this timeline, I don't even want to think about it. Anyway, the Dallas Cowboys won the Super Bowl, the Chicago Bulls beat the Seattle Supersonics in the NBA Finals, the Colorado Avalanche defeated the Florida Panthers for the Stanley Cup, and the New York Yankees beat the Atlanta Braves in the World Series. No Diggity by Blackstreet featuring Dr. Dre was number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 the week of Thanksgiving 1996. Strawberry Wine by Dina Carter topped the country charts, and that's a classic. Star Trek First Contact was number 1 at the box office. I gotta say that's my favorite Star Trek movie of all time. Fight me. 1996 was peak grunge, with jeans, band t-shirts, flannels, and Chuck Taylors dominating the casual fashion scene. Britpop and boy bands were all the rage, and the kids all wanted Tickle Me Elmo and Beanie Babies. We've covered Houston a few times already, so I'll hit the highlights of 1996. The Houston Rockets acquired Charles Barkley that year, and for you basketball fans who know anything about the NBA in the 90s, this was also when the Rockets had Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler. Slab car culture was a big trend in the Houston social scene. If you aren't aware, SLAB is an acronym for slow, loud, and bangin'. That was candy coat paint jobs, big extended wire rims, amazing sound systems, lowering springs, all that. This was also the peak of the chopped and screwed music scene in Houston. The population of Houston was around 1.7 million in 1996 compared to 2.3 million today. In 1996, much like today, Houston's economy relied heavily on the energy sector, healthcare, and the Port of Houston.
Kristen Wilson was born on July 13, 1967, in Houston, Texas, to Bob and Barbara Wilson. The second of 3 daughters, Kristen and her older sister Kim had a close relationship growing up. The pair learned to ride skateboards together and would stay outside until all hours. Kristen's younger sister Kelly was born 3 years after her, and the two had a typical sibling relationship growing up, but got closer as they got older, often hanging out at each other's houses or going out shopping. Kelly describes her older sister as, quote, end quote, perfect, the golden child. She was kind, beautiful, and had an infectious smile. She was always taking care of others, buying gifts for her friends and family, and helping out where she could. Kristen was 29 when she was murdered, and though she wasn't married and didn't have children herself, she threw herself into the role of the doting auntie as Kelly started her own family. Kelly recalls that one of Kristen's favorite things was making scrambled eggs with Kelly's son, Corey. Kristen had just started her own business doing administrative work for other small businesses around town, and she seemed happy and content for the most part. Kristen loved the holidays and special occasions, particularly Christmas. Her friends and family went so far as to call her Miss Christmas. Kristen was looking forward to celebrating Thanksgiving with her family at her grandmother's house in the Houston suburb of Katy that year. Thanksgiving was the biggest celebration of the year, and it was always a huge production. Kristen was eager to help prepare for the holiday meal, so she ran to the grocery store after work on Wednesday, November 27th, to grab a few last-minute items. On Thanksgiving Day, dinner was nearly prepared, and nobody had heard or seen Kristen that day. The family had planned to meet up at Kristen's grandmother's house at 2 p.m., and there was no sign of Kristen. The family waited a little bit, hoping it was a matter of being stuck in traffic or having a minor emergency like a flat tire. Remember, this is 1996. Cell phones weren't common. But when 2:30 rolled around and Kristen's family was unable to reach her by phone, her parents, Bob and Barbara, decided to drive from Katy to the southeast side of Houston to Kristen's apartment. They saw her car in the parking lot and found her door unlocked, and they ventured inside, calling her name as they walked through the apartment. Bob is the one who found his daughter lifeless on her bedroom floor.
Police were called to the scene and started collecting evidence and putting together a timeline. Based on the information from Kristen's family and other witnesses, the last time anyone saw her alive was the afternoon of Wednesday, November 27th. So investigators posited that whoever killed Kristen was lying in wait for her inside her apartment, probably in her bedroom closet. It's important to point out here that Kristen was examined by two different medical examiners. One medical examiner determined that Kristen's cause of death was strangulation and concluded that she was most likely sexually assaulted prior to her death. Some of her clothing had been removed, and she was found naked from the waist down with her clothing pulled up. A second medical examiner, however, felt she hadn't been sexually assaulted. A rape kit was done, but nothing was found. No DNA was present. It was clear to both MEs, however, that Kristen fought with her attacker. She had bruises consistent with defensive wounds and had broken fingernails, suggesting she was hitting or clawing at the person who subdued her. Investigators noted that there was no indication that robbery was a motive. There was nothing of value missing from Kristen's apartment.
During the course of the investigation, police theorized that whoever killed Kristen gained access to her apartment by reaching through the cat door on a window and removing the window screen. The phone line in her apartment was cut, and the intruder had removed light bulbs from the fixtures, so Kristen would have to navigate through a darkened apartment when she got home. Kristen had relayed to her friends and family that she'd been looking to move to another apartment shortly before her death. Apparently, the handyman who worked at the apartment complex let himself into Kristen's apartment unannounced, which understandably creeped her out. Outside of that, she'd never mentioned any other strange people hanging around. Nobody stalking her, watching her, threatening her, or anything like that other than her ex-fiancé Ted, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Unfortunately, Kristen's apartment complex didn't have security cameras, and there was shockingly little evidence at the crime scene. While investigators did develop a few leads and identify persons of interest early on, they never went anywhere, and the case quickly turned cold.
Right. Kristen's younger cousin Tyler was just a kid when she died, but as he got older, he had questions for his family members, and his questioning and investigation led to a stash of Kristen's personal effects that her mother had tucked away in storage. This stash included Kristen's journal, which provided a wealth of insight into her personal life at the time. It also dredged up memories of conversations and relationships from the past. From the information I've been able to get my hands on, there were 3 men described as being, quote, in Kristen's life, end quote. So these men are her ex-fiancé Ted, a married man named Alistair, with whom Kristen had an affair, and her best friend Sam. Ted apparently wasn't the best partner to Kristen. He had started drinking heavily and taking pills during their relationship, and the couple started fighting more and talking less, leading Kristen to end things about 1.5 years before her death. Ted didn't take the breakup very well, and things escalated to the point where the police got involved. I don't know if there was any physical violence. Ted did things like follow her to her car, show up to her house unannounced, that kind of thing.
The ABC 13 interview we're using as a main source here. Kristen's mother, Barb, did say she recalled Kristen calling her once before she and Ted broke up to say she'd locked herself in the bathroom to get away from Ted. But Barb couldn't remember all the details. We don't know if he was physically harming her or if he was getting in her face or if he was just being annoying and she needed a break.
So, between that and the behavior after the breakup, it stands to reason that she was afraid of Ted in any case. The second man in Kristen's life prior to her death was a man named Alistair. Kristen's office was in the same building as he worked, and the two started seeing each other about a year before her death. Alistair was a wealthy Scottish businessman about 20 years older than her, and he fell head over heels for Kristen. There was just one hiccup. He was married and had no intention of leaving his wife. Kristen's family actually knew about this relationship, and they warned her to steer clear of this guy, but hormones are hormones. Kristen's sisters didn't know he was married, but they always got a creepy feeling from him.
And we should mention that Alistair stayed somewhat involved with Kristen's family after her murder, offering to pay the bulk of her funeral cost. We'll talk about this in more detail when we get to theories. The third man in Kristen's life is Sam, her best friend. Sam didn't like Ted, and Kristen knew this. So while she would confide in Sam about many things, she kept Sam in the dark as far as how bad things had gotten in her relationship. Kristen actually had feelings for Sam, and the two had a brief fling, but it didn't work out, and Kristen ended up staying with Ted. None of these guys were ever suspects, and all three volunteered their DNA for comparison, though none came back as a match. Forensic testing in 1996 wasn't nearly as good as it is today. And remember, there was no DNA found inside Kristen, even though one medical examiner felt she'd been sexually assaulted. The DNA evidence investigators did have came from Kristen's clothing and the phone cord in her apartment. Just making sure we're making things clear.
As of 2021, some of the evidence from the crime scene was sent back to the lab for testing to see if advancements in forensic science could shed some new light on the case. The detective on the case in 2021 also revealed that he'd recently discovered that some of the evidence from the scene had never actually been tested for DNA in the first place, which again, this is hindsight bias because things were different in 1996. That was 4 years ago, and as far as I can tell, no new evidence has come to light to generate any suspects. The case is still open and still being investigated. So what happened to Kristen Wilson in November of 1996?
So let's look at the most obvious possibility here. One of the three men in Kristen's life had something to do with it. Ted was not a nice guy. He had a history of stalking and following Kristen, and the two had a nasty breakup a year and a half prior to her death. Was Ted capable of violence? I can't say for sure, but it's not that big of a leap to go from yelling and stalking to physical violence. We said earlier that the DNA collected from the scene didn't match Ted or the other two men tested. But it's important to clarify something. Investigators cannot rule any of the three men out based on the DNA tested thus far. That doesn't mean one of them, or someone else entirely, won't be identified as a match in the future. Forensic science gets better and better every day.
And before you go thinking, well, they broke up a year and a half before she was murdered, a year and a half is a long time. Surely he would have moved on or gotten bored by then. I wouldn't be so sure. I've known people who followed, harassed, stalked, and or bothered their exes for years after they broke up. One person I know broke up with her ex nearly a decade ago and still acts a fool. Some people just can't let go. If Ted knew more than he let on, we may never know, however, as he died of cancer in 2014. DNA will be the only thing to either rule him out or identify him as the perpetrator if it ever comes to that.
Alistair. We don't really know a whole lot about him. According to the family, he locked up pretty quickly, and we don't have access to any of his conversations with the police. Again, open investigation and all that. The family is a bit suspicious of him because of his behavior after Kristen's death. He kept in touch with the family and offered to pay for a large part of the funeral cost. Kristen's sisters found this odd and wondered why this married man was so eager to contribute financially. He also offered to pay to have a shed or a man cave built for Kristen's father. Again, Kristen's sisters wondered why he was doing this. Was he overcompensating for something? Was he sincere and simply felt bad about the situation? Or was he trying to keep suspicion off him? Alistair lives in Houston today, but he doesn't speak to the press about this incident or his relationship with Kristen. Again, it will come down to forensic science or a witness coming forward to put him at the scene if he was involved.
Lastly, there's Sam. Sam has spoken publicly about his relationship with Kristen, and I honestly don't have an opinion on him one way or the other. Could there be some motive there? I suppose. He did have a brief affair with Kristen, but she broke it off and went back to her then-boyfriend Ted. But that would have been more than a year and a half before the murder. And Kristen did eventually break up with Ted. If there were still lingering feelings between the two, they could have just started dating again, pick up where they left off. Short of a confession or DNA match, we just don't know.
Investigators and the family do tend to believe that Kristen was killed by someone she knew. Investigators and the family do tend to believe that Kristen was killed by someone she knew, given the circumstances. She was killed in her own home by someone who broke in and laid in wait. Strangulation tends to be a very personal crime, and statistically speaking, people tend to be murdered by someone in their circle. That being said, there is the possibility that Kristen was murdered by someone who knew her more casually, someone who knew of her, or someone who didn't know her at all. She lived in an apartment complex in a big city. There is always the chance that someone was watching her and waiting for the right moment to strike. Someone who knew her movements and habits, knew that she had a cat door, knew what time she came home from work, knew that she lived alone. Perhaps a neighbor or an employee at the apartment complex. Perhaps a serial killer or stalker in the area that honed in on Kristen as his next target.
And let's talk about the way Kristen's body was positioned. That adds an interesting twist as well.
Oh yeah. So Kristen's body was found laying face up on her bedroom floor, which we mentioned earlier. But her legs were crossed at the ankles and her hands were folded on her chest. The investigators working the case now pointed out that this is very unusual in cases where sexual assault is a possibility. Usually, victims who have been sexually assaulted are found with their legs apart. So, in all likelihood, Kristen's killer moved her to that position. But why? Was it someone who knew her and felt remorse? Was it someone leaving a calling card? Was it someone trying to send a message? Or was this person trying to move her body, perhaps to transport it somewhere else, and maybe they got spooked and just left her that way? Partially moved. There are lots of possibilities, and it may mean nothing at all, but it's definitely worth mentioning.
So that's where we are as of April 2025. If you have any information regarding the murder of Kristen Wilson on November 27th, 1996, please contact the Houston Police Department at 713-884-3131 or Crime Stoppers at 713-222-TIPS. That's 713-222-8477.
Halloween is supposed to be fun for kids of all ages. It's a time to relax and escape the real world with costumes, pranks, haunted houses, parties, and of course, eating extra candy. For one family in Dickinson, Texas, Halloween serves as a stark reminder of just how cruel and evil the real world can be.
In 2006, Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. Montenegro declared independence from Serbia. Hamas gained a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council. A series of train bombings rocked India, and Pluto was demoted from planet to dwarf planet. Twitter made its debut, Google bought YouTube, Italy won the World Cup, and speed skater Shawnee Davis became the first Black American athlete to win an individual gold medal in the Winter Olympics. They were held in Turin, Italy that year, by the way. The week of October 31st, Moneymaker by Ludacris featuring Pharrell was at the top of the Billboard Hot 100, and I Loved Her First by Heartland topped the country charts. Saw 3 was number 1 at the box office that week, and Mitch Albom's For One More Day topped the New York Times bestseller list. Dickinson, Texas is part of the Houston, the Woodlands, Sugarland metro area. Today it has a population of just under 21,000, and in 2006 it would have had about 18,000 people. Unlike many of the towns we've covered here at Box in the Basement, Dickinson was actually settled before the railroad came through. But the construction of the Galveston, Houston, and Henderson railroads certainly helped bring people and jobs to the area. The town has a really interesting history, and I could honestly nerd out for about an hour, but I'll just give you the basics here. Dickinson's economy in the 1920s was boosted not by the railroad, but by organized crime. The Maceo Crime Syndicate was a major player in Galveston at the time, and they invested in infrastructure and entertainment in Dickinson. The city was all but destroyed by Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and this town nobody's heard of gained worldwide attention when its city officials attempted to force locals to sign loyalty pledges to Israel in order to get disaster relief after that hurricane. Yikes on bikes.
Terressa Vanegas was born on August 9, 1990, in Galveston, Texas, to parents Javier and Jeanette. She was one of 5 siblings. She had 3 sisters, Jackie, Amber, and Amanda. and a brother named Frankie. Teressa's family moved to nearby Dickinson, Texas, and in 2006, she was a 16-year-old student at Dickinson High School. She was a good student. She had a loyal circle of friends who adored her, and her family describes her as being loving and kind. She had a large family and was close with them. Her sisters have mentioned in interviews that she loved doing quote-unquote girly things with them, like doing each other's hair and giving each other mani-pedis. She was also very close to her grandmother Betty and often stayed with her over summer breaks and on weekends. Teressa also had a little dog named Tinkerbell that went everywhere with her. October 31st, 2006, started out like most days in the Vanegas house. It was a Tuesday, so Teressa went to school and everything seemed normal. That evening, Teressa, like many teenagers do, decided to go to a couple of Halloween parties. At least that's what I could gather from the scant resources we have on this case. Police say they've been able to piece together a fairly solid timeline, but not all of the timeline has been made public. So we're going to do our very best here. Crime writer David Lohr put together what's probably the best and most thorough summary of facts laid out in the available articles and sources. Some of the things he references simply aren't available anymore. Archive posts, broken links, that kind of a thing. So we'll be relying heavily on his timeline and the available sources we do have. Okay, so before Teressa headed to her friends' houses, she apparently attempted to meet up with an older guy she'd met online. We don't know too much about this guy, but we do know that he was 19 and he lived in Abilene, Texas, which is about a 6-hour drive from Dickinson. She reportedly couldn't get a ride to his house. In any case, Teressa eventually gave up and went to a friend's place for a party. Multiple witnesses placed her at a house party at around 11 p.m., and other witnesses later placed her at a different house party about a mile away at 12:30 a.m. Other witness statements placed Teressa at a gas station about a half mile from where she attended the first party, but the timeline is unclear here. The security camera footage from the convenience store had been overwritten by the time investigators traced her movements there. And if you're wondering, it's assured that all or most of these movements were made on foot. Teressa was seen walking from her own neighborhood to the first house party.
Teressa never returned home. Her family wasn't overly concerned at first. Like we mentioned earlier, this was a fairly small community, and she was known to spend nights with friends without communicating her whereabouts to her family. Teressa had also apparently told her family that she'd planned to stay the night with a friend on Halloween and didn't inform them that her plans had changed. When she didn't come home from school on Wednesday, November 1st, however, Teressa's family started to worry about her, and they notified law enforcement shortly thereafter. Interestingly, I've seen Teressa described in a couple of articles written at the time as a runaway. I've seen some reporting that she did indeed run away a few days before she went missing, and that wasn't the first time. But I think there also might be some confusion on reporters' part due to a strange set of circumstances involving a friend of hers who also went missing a few days earlier, but we'll discuss that more here in a few minutes. On Friday, November 3rd, a person riding a dirt bike in a field behind Dickinson High School made a horrifying discovery. The body of a teenage girl was lying in a shallow drainage ditch about 200 yards from the school. 16-year-old Terressa had been strangled with a belt, sexually assaulted, and her long wavy hair she was so proud of had been cut off. Her shirt was torn off, her shoes were missing, and her pants had been pulled down around her knees. She'd also been badly beaten, particularly around her face, and her father noticed cuts on her hand when he saw her body prior to the funeral. The medical examiner stated that the manner of death was homicide, but neither the ME or investigators ever publicly stated a cause of death, claiming that it simply wasn't clear. The examination revealed that she'd been dead approximately 2 days when her remains were found, which means she was probably killed not long after she was last sighted near her own neighborhood. A volunteer search of the area near the crime scene the next week turned up some additional pieces of evidence initially missed by law enforcement. Searchers found Teressa's hair clip and glasses just 15 feet from where her body was found. The distribution of the evidence and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance suggested to investigators that she wasn't killed in the same place she was found. DNA samples were submitted for analysis, but nothing has come of that part of the investigation as of today. Investigators had tons of leads early on in the investigation, but those eventually led to dead ends.
So what happened to Terressa Vanegas on Halloween night 2006? There are so many possible answers to that question. The first possibility is that there is some link to this guy Terressa met online. This man, who we only know as Ambrosio, was 19 and lived in Abilene, which is over 300 miles from Dickinson. He and Terressa met in an online chat room on the website for Dope House Records, which was a local record label founded by rapper Carlos Coy, better known as South Park Mexican. Records show that Ambrosio from Abilene had talked to Terressa quite a bit, and Terressa made it clear she intended to run away from home and go to him. Ambrosio spoke to journalist David Lohr, telling him that he and Terressa had been chatting online for about 3 months at the time, and that he proposed to her 3 days before her death. The night she died, she had every intention of getting a ride to Abilene, but for whatever reason, she couldn't get a ride and decided to go to the 2 house parties instead. When David Lohr spoke to Ambrosio in mid-November of 2006, police had not yet spoken to him about Teressa's death, which I find very odd, but not necessarily surprising. I had my doubts that Ambrosio had anything to do with this crime. He was 300 plus miles away in Abilene. He wasn't coming to Dickinson to pick up Terressa. She was planning to go to him. The fact that he was willing to talk to a journalist right after her death makes me think he wasn't involved.
I agree. I don't think he was involved, but it's important to consider all angles. Since they were talking to each other and had an online relationship, it's definitely something to look into. I do wonder if the cops ever talked to him in person. So we mentioned earlier that Teressa's friend disappeared shortly before her death, and that opens up yet another angle that we should look into. 15-year-old Kimberly Ramsey ran away from home with an older teen named Cody Birdwell on October 29th, and she was still missing at the same time Terressa went missing. Kimberly was a habitual runaway, and she and Terressa had even run away together in the past at some point, but they usually turned up within a few days, none the worse for wear. Kimberly was found alive with her boyfriend Cody in nearby Rusk, Texas on November 9th, and police believe that it was all just a strange coincidence. David Lohr also spoke to Cody's family, and they claimed that Cody didn't know Terressa. He and Kimberly had only been dating a few weeks. So while it seems police did examine this angle, it was all ruled out. And I would tend to agree. As much as I hate coincidences, both Kimberly and Terressa did have a history of running away. Kimberly apparently threatened to run away on national television just before all this happened. She and her mother were on the Dr. Phil show. Cody had a steady job, he wasn't a bad kid, and his family seemed genuinely surprised that he would do something like this. I don't think he had anything to do with it.
So that leaves two other possibilities. Either it was someone else she knew, or at least knew casually, or she was a target of opportunity. Police conducted something like 45 interviews in the days following the discovery of Teressa's body. And while they had some leads, nothing has ever panned out. Witnesses say they told investigators that they'd seen Terressa speaking to an older man at one of the house parties she attended the night she disappeared, but there aren't any more details than that. Police did collect DNA evidence from the scene. Remember, Terressa had been strangled and sexually assaulted. But so far, there haven't been any matches. So unless someone grows a pair and comes forward with information, or DNA testing gets a hit in the future, the prospects look bleak here.
The part about her hair being cut kind of leads me to believe that it was someone she knew.
I agree with that. That seems very personal, very petty and cruel. Several people mentioned in interviews that Terressa's hair was a point of pride for her. It was long, dark, and wavy, and she loved styling it and caring for it. The fact that someone took the time to cut it all off seems extremely telling.
Should we mention South Park Mexican?
Yes. I don't know that he had anything to do with this personally, but it does bring up another interesting possibility.
So we mentioned Dope House Records earlier. This was the label that Carlos Coy, better known as South Park Mexican, started, and its website was the one that Terressa and her online boyfriend frequented. Carlos Coy is a piece of shit. He was convicted of aggravated sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl and sentenced to 45 years in prison in 2002. So he would have already been behind bars when Terressa went missing, but his label and website were still up and running. And as we know from recent public examples, sex offenders tend to flock together. Perhaps it was someone in his circle who saw the message traffic on the website and saw Terressa as a potential target. She was only 16 at the time. Likewise, it could have been another user on the site that was either able to track her down or it was someone with whom she interacted. This was 2006, and she was just a kid. I know I certainly wasn't as careful as I should have been online when I was younger. And don't interpret that as me placing blame on the victim. I'm just saying a lot of times people simply aren't aware of how easy it is to track folks down online, especially if you're being targeted by someone who has more knowledge of technology than you do.
That's a very good point. In any case, that's where we are with this case right now. If you have any information at all on the murder and sexual assault of Terressa Vanegas in 2006, please contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest.
If you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options. Visit victimconnect.org to learn more. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com.
Autumn's Oddities is a strange and unusual podcast made by The Strange and Unusual, me, Autumn Gruby. Each week, I'll be taking you through some of the creepiest cases true crime has to offer. It won't only be true crime, I'll also be covering cryptids, haunted places, haunted things, and the true stories that inspired horror movies. Listen every Monday and Friday for new episodes. And remember, if it's creepy and weird, you'll find it here.
If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurelis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurelis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. This podcast has a bigger purpose than just providing information and entertainment. The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act is a bipartisan bill that was signed into law by Congress in 2021, and we want to see it put into action. This law establishes a systematic process for reviewing case files related to cold case murders. The focus is on providing a mechanism for the families and friends of murder victims to request a formal review of such cases. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators. I also have a GoFundMe page to hire an attorney to help me get a copy of his autopsy that I have been denied for 27 years. You can find the GoFundMe by searching for Leon Laurelis. That's Laureles. But to get his body exhumed, to search for evidence that was not collected the first time around. We and other families and friends need assistance with getting FOIA requests. It blows our minds that so many murders occurred from 1976 to 1997 in Brownwood, Texas, under the watch of the same investigators responsible for handling Leon's case. We're going to look at all the unsolved murders in Brownwood, and maybe even a few solved ones if it helps uncover what was happening in that era that left so many families devastated and a community living in fear. If you want to hear more about victim-focused, unsolved cases and get updates about what we know,